while simultaneously leveraging opportunities for economic prosperity in our rural communities. What are we here, and that's what we're here to present to you today. Next slide. So Ontario's land base is consisting of prime agricultural lands, and they are a finite and required protection for the long-term viability and prosperity of agriculture, food, and our economies. And as we know, the PPS, that prime agricultural areas are to be protected for long-term use for agriculture. Within these areas, permitted uses and activities include agriculture, agricultural-related uses, and on-farm diversified uses. And in 2016, the OMAFRA guidelines on permitted uses in Ontario's prime agricultural areas were released to define better criteria for supporting planning for on-farm diversified uses. On-farm diversified uses are defined as uses that are secondary to the principal agricultural use of the property and are limited in area. On-farm diversified uses, or OFDUs, as we like to call them, include but are not limited to home occupations, home industries, agritourism uses, and uses that produce value-added agricultural products. Under these guidelines, the range of activities that could be on-farm diversified uses is almost limitless. Next slide. On this slide, you will see some examples of on-farm diversified uses. And again, on-farm diversified uses can be anything and almost everything. And examples here include things like farm markets, breweries, distilleries, yurts or lodging, food vendors or restaurants, or various agritourism. Next slide.
Awesome. Thanks, Pam, for that introduction. So these uses have many benefits, including allowing agriculture and farm operators to prosper, ensuring that the land base is protected for future generations, ensuring that agriculture is the primary land use, diversifying rural economies, creating jobs, promoting an appreciation of agriculture, amongst many others. So within policy, OFDUs are to be compatible with and shall not hinder surrounding agricultural operations. So in this regard, controlling size and scale of on-farm diversified uses is key to protecting and maintaining the land base for agriculture and supporting a thriving agricultural industry and rural economy. So the permitted use guidelines are the first tool that provides family farming entrepreneurs and municipalities with guidance to create on-farm diversified uses. Undoubtedly, OFDUs bring many benefits to farmers and their communities, and they're encouraged in provincial policy, yet translating these guidelines into local action is easier said than done. So how do we ensure local policy fits both the short-term and the long-term needs and desires of our farmers and their communities? How do we ensure on-farm diversified uses are limited in size and scale or compatible with surrounding land uses? What about preserving or contributing to the character of our communities? If an OFDU becomes too successful and wants to expand, should they stay in the agricultural area? And what about cumulative effects? So whether having multiple OFDUs on one property or accumulating in the greater agricultural area. All of these questions bring us to our research objectives. So within the scope of our study, which also includes Pam's dissertation and the broader project funded through the Alliance, our project will identify current trends in on-farm diversification, understand how on-farm diversification impacts the family farm. It'll explore the intersection of on-farm diversification and land preservation through public planning policy in Ontario, specifically through the context of the guidelines. It'll explore which rural municipalities are using this tool efficiently and effectively and identify best practices for doing so. It'll identify policy barriers that limit the expansion or establishment of on-farm diversified activity. It'll propose changes if necessary. And all in all, this research will help ensure that the policy framework for OFDUs supports joint goals of protecting farmland while also contributing to the development of agricultural livelihoods. And all in all, the research will benefit municipalities and the farm community as they work together to implement these guidelines. So this study uses 4 key methods to help us meet our research objectives. So first, we undertook a literature review exploring trends in on-farm diversification in North America and Europe. Secondly, we just finished our surveys. So one survey was sent to rural upper tier and single tier municipalities, as well as planning boards across the province. Altogether, we heard back from 36 municipalities and planning boards. We also sent a survey out to farmers who either currently have an on-farm diversified use, are planning one, or have retired from one. So based on this criteria, we heard back from 147 eligible farmers participating in our survey. Data analysis is underway for both. And currently, we are undertaking interviews with provincial planners, municipal planners, and farmers about their experiences with on-farm diversification and policy impacts. And lastly, we intend on hosting 3 focus groups with each of these stakeholder groups come the late fall. And our intention is to build consensus, validate key findings, and have these groups contribute to the discussion on what's next for OFDU policy. So although we are in the middle of data collection, we have heard some pervasive themes within our interviews, and we would like to share some of those findings with you all today. So I'll start off by sharing some of the stories or insights I've heard from farmers. So to begin, farmers have very diverse and complex reasons for diversifying. Of course, income generation is the most common one that we would expect and is commonly mentioned so far by our participants. But in actuality, reasons for diversifying or choosing a particular avenue for diversification is quite complex. So just one example, some farmers want to diversify in a way that's environmentally and socially sustainable, like using their OFDU to provide opportunities for community gathering, recreation opportunities, or access to green space, or teaching others about food production and environmental stewardship. As I said, that's just one example, but it is to show that we should recognize and account for these different reasons when developing policy to permit OFDUs to ensure the policies put in place work and fit the needs of our communities and achieve maximum benefit. So in terms of diversification, we see expected uses like expanding pick your own opportunities or on-farm markets. And then we also see some less conventional uses like Airbnbs or rural retreats is what I'm hearing them being called now. Campgrounds, forest schools, campfire rentals, and wedding venues. So it's critical to note that emerging from this research in the increase of these unconventional uses in the prime ag area, such as with wedding venues, they're not necessarily being driven by farmers themselves. Instead, they're often being driven by the demand of urbanites, so to say, traveling and visiting rural areas, especially during COVID. And I see this especially with weddings or forest schools, rural retreats, and campgrounds. Farmers are all sharing similar sentiments that this was not their idea, so to say, but that the opportunity came from visitors literally knocking on their door and waving dollars in their face. Yeah, and so moving on, it's important to note that a farm might have multiple OFDUs and that they can range in size, scale, and even time in which they operate, which is so far what we've seen in the case of this research. And it's probably unsurprising that COVID is impacting the types and quantity of businesses that farmers are undertaking. So for example, someone who has an OFDU that's dependent on clients spending disposable income may be looking to further diversify to mitigate any risk in relying solely on income from their main OFDU. Similarly, farmers with OFDUs that rely on indoor gatherings are now looking to expand outdoors to be able to accommodate visitors in a time during COVID. And yeah, so there are many benefits to OFDUs that we're hearing about, and those include, having OFDUs be an attractive opportunity for new farmers or entrants, providing enhanced opportunities for succession planning is a big theme, or even retaining youth or providing employment for youth in the rural area. The planning approval process, however, has rarely been easy for farmers. In many cases, barriers such as time and money needed to secure an official plan amendment, a zoning bylaw amendment, or to fund different studies or what have you, has not just discouraged farmers from formally establishing an OFDU, but has led them to operate in non-conforming ways. If the municipal planning process doesn't work for them in terms of time, money, or even relationships or a sense of trust with the municipality, then the sentiment I'm hearing is that they will try to run an OFDU underground, especially if not diversifying means potentially losing the farm.
Speakeasy
Additionally, farmers find navigating the overall process to be very confusing and have suggested that municipalities are often trying to figure out policy themselves. And suggestions for the above include making certain uses as of right in policy, having a different fee structure for farmers, having a point person or contact at the municipality who's familiar with on-farm diversification to assist in providing service and establishing the use.
Great, thanks, Emily. In terms of preliminary findings from planners, both provincial and municipal planners, we found that the guidelines are a great start and are beginning to work after 5 years of implementation, but there is definitely more work that needs to be completed now. Municipalities are utilizing the guidelines in various degrees. Some are not using the guidelines at all, and others have implemented those guidelines into their official plan, policies, and zoning bylaw provisions. More education is needed on the guidelines. We've heard that very similar to training sessions for MDS, planners are wanting that outreach. The guidelines are not very user-friendly for farmers, and they're written in a language that is understood by planners. There needs to be more of a clear understanding of what a farm is in relation to the OFDU. And we've heard various stories from planners that farmers are, excited about the opportunities, and therefore even rural residential lots that are 5 to 10 acres are being challenged as a farm. The guidelines do not assist much with large-scale temporal events, and those are things like concerts or seasonal events, and planners are looking for more information and assistance with that. The province outlines utilizing planning tools like the official plan amendment or a zoning bylaw amendment or a site plan, but they're often just too expensive for farmers, especially in various studies are required. And more education to farmers is needed on why prime agricultural areas need to be protected specifically. Next slide. So in conclusion, we must recognize that the family farm is evolving, and so are agricultural areas. Farmers have many diverse and complex motivations behind diversifying. It is a key means to helping farmers stay in agriculture and to make agriculture viable for future farmers. We're no longer just producing food on farms, and we must recognize that farms are multifunctional units in our communities. To support them now in diversifying is to support them and the betterment of our communities for the future. At the same time, agricultural land preservation is a hot topic, and for good reason. We must simultaneously preserve agricultural lands for the present and future of agricultural and our food systems. While policy promotes on-farm diversified uses to balance farmland preservation and rural economic development, it is easier said than done to permit OFDUs at the local level. How can we design policy to benefit farmers and their entrepreneurial endeavors, as well as our agricultural areas? This research will help contribute to the understanding. We hope to identify best practices for how farmers and planning policy can work together to achieve a balanced approach for farmland preservation and economic opportunities. Next slide. Emily and I will be finishing the interviews with the planners and farmers this summer. After that, we will analyze our survey and interview data to identify our major findings. And to build consensus on findings and suggested recommendations emerging from our research, we'll be hosting again those virtual focus groups later this fall in 2021. Our final report to OMAFRA will be available in 2022, and it will be available on Wayne's website. And a few other things that we have in the works right now are presenting at the OPPI conference in 2021, which is confirmed, as well as a few other potential projects with Plan Canada. An article on this research in the context of OFDUs operating during COVID was available in the last issue of the OPPI Y magazine. And there was also an article featured just yesterday in the Globe and Mail. Next slide. So again, Emily and I would like to thank everyone for listening. We welcome any questions, and our contact information is on the screen if you're interested in learning more about the research. Thanks.